I'm also the moderator of today's conversation on inequality with philosopher Kristi Olson of Bowdoin College, entitled, How Should We Measure Multidimensional Inequality? A Philosopher's Approach. Now, I have a keen interest in multidimensional measurement that was sparked by Kristi's advisor and my co-author, Amartya Sen, and so I'm particularly thankful for her being here today. I see multidimensional measures as practical tools for coordinating policy action and supporting good governance. Our first discussant today is economist Luis Felipe Lopez Calva, who's a familiar figure here at GW's IEP from his days at the World Bank, and who also helped develop the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index at the UNDP, which is a key multidimensional measure that's sensitive to inequality. Our second discussant is analytical philosopher and attorney Jeffrey Brand, who is an even more familiar figure here at GW as the former Associate Dean for Graduate Studies in the Arts College, and like today's presenter, has a JD as well as a PhD. For those of you who've attended an IAP event, either in the Elliott School of International Affairs or more recently online, you can expect an informative, nonpartisan exchange of views on topics like urbanization and poverty, global governance, US-China economic relations, and digital trade. Our next event, curiously titled Innovations in Digital Trade, the Sequel, will be presented Thursday at 11 in conjunction with the Elliott School's Digital Hub. My colleague Susan Aronson will host a panel of experts to discuss US-UK cooperation in this important space. On the 23rd of this month, representatives from the IMF's Africa division will present the Regional Economic Outlook on Sub-Saharan Africa, featuring chapters on COVID-19, climate change, and digitalization. And finally, at the end of this month, IIEP will be joined by Sabina Alkire and the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative to present the newest results from the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, the UNDP's multidimensional poverty measure based on the Alkire-Foster methodology. Today's event is the fifth in our Facing Inequality series, which began with Branko Milanovic several weeks ago and has continued about every 2 weeks since then. Our next event on July 30th will feature political economist Benjamin Brown of Princeton discussing central banks and inequality. Nita Rudra of Georgetown's Government Department will discuss informality and trade 2 weeks later. By the way, you can find videos of all our events on IIEP's YouTube channel or by going to our website at iiep.gwu.edu. Please have a look. Now, to introduce our speakers and to explain the rationale behind the series as a whole, allow me to introduce Trevor Jackson, who's an affiliate of the Institute and an historian from GW's own history department, specializing in inequality and in crises. Trevor?
Thank you, James. And it's a pleasure to be here, a pleasure to be introduced, and a pleasure to see everyone. So this Facing Inequality series evolved out of an existing interdisciplinary seminar on inequality, convened and hosted by myself and Brian Stewart of the GW Economics Department. And we realized that inequality, especially over the last, say, 6 or 7 years, has become an increasingly salient subject, both for policy, for political discussion, and for research. More and more economists have become interested in subjects of distribution and inequality, while at the same time historians, looking for somewhere to go after the 2008 financial crisis, have become increasingly clear that we work on nothing but inequality. It's just that none of us had realized it until recently. So on that basis, we found a firm ground for interdisciplinary conversation, and once we began that, we discovered that inequality was a subject with many dimensions, as today's talk will address explicitly. And so it proved to be a useful forum to bring together policymakers, economists, historians, sociologists, lawyers, philosophers who are also lawyers, and many others to talk across their disciplinary boundaries about how to think about inequality, how to research it, how to teach it, and perhaps how to address it from a policy standpoint. As James said, this is our fifth in an ongoing series. As an economic historian of inequality and impunity, I'm always happy to talk about multidimensional poverty and inequality, especially with lawyers and philosophers. All the more so, of course, today on the 231st anniversary of the fall of the Bastille. As I'm sure you know, it's the 26th of Messidor in the year 231 of the Republic. And on that note, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, who is Kristi Olson, an assistant professor of philosophy at Bowdoin College, where she works on issues of distributive justice. As we've heard, she has her PhD from Harvard under the supervision of luminaries in the field of thinking about inequality, including Amartya Sen. She's been published widely in journals like Philosophy and Public Affairs, the Canadian Journal of Philosophy, as well as Politics, Philosophy, and Economics. Prior to pursuing her PhD, she worked as a public interest lawyer. And she's going to speak to us today about how we should measure multidimensional inequality, a philosopher's approach, open parentheses, with COVID applications, close parentheses. And so, with no further ado, Kristi, take it away.
All right, great. So I want to begin by thanking the hosts for that lovely introduction and also for organizing this important conference and for inviting me to participate in it. So I've long bemoaned the fact that many of us, well, this part I haven't bemoaned, the fact that many of us are working on the same questions. The problem is that we're not talking to one another. So you have people in economics and people in philosophy working on similar questions, as well as in other disciplines, both inside and outside of academia, and yet we rarely talk to one another. So for that reason, I was especially grateful to be invited to today's event. So as you've heard, I'm going to be asking the question, how should we measure multidimensional inequality? And I'm going to be giving you a philosopher's approach. But let me just say now that I'm really hoping that there's going to be a rich exchange of information and views. And I would love to continue this conversation. My email is at the bottom of this page, kolson@bowdoin.edu. All right, so just to give a little background for how it is that I got involved in this project, I've been working on a book looking at the principles for a fair income distribution. This has been what I've been obsessing about for many years. And one thing that I noticed is that both people on the far left and people on the right were both saying, look, you can't just look at income inequality without also taking into account the fact that jobs are different. So you have the leftist philosopher G.A. Cohen saying, look, it's just flatly absurd to ignore differences in work when you're looking at inequalities in income. And at the same time, you have the conservative economist Milton Friedman saying almost exactly the same thing. So he said, look, if different jobs are being paid the same, their incomes in a more fundamental sense would be unequal. So the question that interested me was, okay, well, how do we look at an income distribution while also taking into account the fact that jobs vary on these many dimensions? And unfortunately, that's a question that even though G.A. Cohen stressed the fact that we need to do that, he didn't give us a way in which to take these variables into account. So here's just a table representing sort of what the issue was. So I've listed just a few occupational positions on the left, and then I've listed the Bureau of Labor Statistics median income or the mean income. And the question was, so these jobs vary along a number of dimensions. So the years of training, physical and mental burdens, the risk to health, mental stress, autonomy, flexibility, duration, etc. And the question was, how do we take all of that into account and determine the labor adjusted income? Right, because if we had the labor adjusted income, then we could measure inequality while looking at both income and these labor differences. And the reason this was a really difficult question is not just because there's all these dimensions, so I've just listed a few in which jobs vary, but also because people reasonably make different trade-offs between them. So one person might be willing to accept a greater risk to health in exchange for more income, while someone else would much rather have less income with also less risk to health. So what my book did was it answered this question of how do we determine the labor adjusted income. I don't give numerical values, but I say how in principle would we come up with the answer to that question. And what I only belatedly realized is that while looking at this question, I was actually asking and answering a much more general question. So that only recently came to me that that's what I was doing. So here's a way of putting the generic problem. So this is a philosopher, Richard Arneson. If Smith has a nice house, a clunky car, access to the beach, and a PhD from Yale, whereas Jones has a spectacular house, a Jaguar, no beach access, and a high school diploma, who has the greater resource share? So today what I want to do is answer this question. But in order to answer this question, I'm going to have to tweak it. So that's just in the interest of full disclosure. I'm not going to be able to say who has the greater resource share, but I'm going to be asking and answering a similar question. All right, so here's a different way of portraying the generic problem. So I'm looking at Anna and Belle. So this is Anna's bundle, might be, say, apples and oranges. It might, on the other hand, be a spectacular house, a Jaguar, no beach access, and a high school diploma. Or more realistically, in terms of people working on this in the international context, it might be income, education, and self-assessed health status. Or near and dear to my own heart, it might be jobs, income, and COVID risks. So it could be anything. And the question is just, Anna is better off in one respect than Belle, but Belle is better off in a different respect. So in this graph, and the question is, how are we going to compare them? So throughout today, I'm going to leave open what exactly is in the bundles, but the idea is that the solution I propose should be able to go across all of these bundles. Katja, it's automatically, the slides are going forward. I wonder if there's some way to prevent that, but I'm just going to continue. All right, so one possibility of what we could do is to look at thresholds. So in the chart on the left, I'm going to say that Belle is below some sort of poverty threshold. And we might say, well, look, if you're below the poverty threshold in just one dimension, then you're in poverty. That might be reasonable in some contexts. And so we might say in that context that it's easy to decide who is worse off, Anna or Belle, because Belle is in poverty and Anna is not. So that might be one thing that we could say. I'm not going to say that today. And the reason I'm not going to say that is because I think the reasons we have for wanting to measure poverty are different from our reasons for wanting to measure inequality. And in order to get at just that unique reason for wanting to measure inequality, I'm going to assume that the people are above the poverty line. That's not because we've solved the problem of poverty, although that would be nice, but that even if we did solve the problem of poverty, there would still be this separate question of inequality. And I'm also going to set aside the instrumental effects of inequality. So I just want to look at purely inequality. Why do we have a reason to care about it? All right, so here's something else that we could do. We could just aggregate. So on the left, I've just said, all right, suppose that Anna had 7 apples and 5 oranges. I'm just going to add that up and get 12. And suppose that Belle had 3 apples and 11 oranges. I'm going to add that up and get 14. And therefore, Belle is better off than Anna. And there's some problems with that. So one problem is it's just not clear how we would add up, say, a Jaguar, no beach access, and a high school diploma, right? How do we add up those different things? But another problem is that when I was adding up apples and oranges, I was assuming that they're given equal weight and also that there's no interaction effects. And the problem is that if they were given different weights, or if there were interaction effects such that it's better to have sort of roughly equal numbers of apples and oranges, say, then we're going to get a different result. So that's just looking at the chart on the right. So the question is, well, then how should we weight them? And what I'm going to do today is look at some different proposals for how it is that we're going to make these comparisons. And the different proposals have one thing in common, which is that they're all going to take into account individuals' preferences. So taking individuals' preferences into account, how are we going to figure out who's better off, A or B, and by how much? All right, so the plan for today is I'm going to start by looking at what I call individualist approaches. I call them individualist approaches because they defer to the preferences of the individual assigned that particular bundle. So that will make more sense in a minute. But specifically, I'm going to look at subjective utility, the envy test, what I call the envy minimizing test. And then I'm not going to discuss the egalitarian equivalent, but I list it here because it's another example of an individualist approach, and I'm happy to talk about it during Q&A. So after talking about the individualist approaches, I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about desiderata. So what would we want our solution to look like? What sort of criteria would it be great if it was able to satisfy? Then I'm going to move into what I call the solidarity solution. And the difference between the solidarity solution and the individualist approaches is that I look at people's preferences over all bundles, right? Whereas the individualist approach just looked at the individual who is assigned a particular bundle, her preferences. And then finally, I'm going to just talk briefly about some next steps. All right, so moving on now, we're going to be talking about the individualist approaches. So the first one is familiar to most of us, so it's just looking at subjective utility. So the idea here would just be to say, Anna, so what is your subjective utility? How much utility does your bundle give you on, say, a scale of 1 to 10? And then when we would ask Bell that same question. And the really well-known problem with this approach is that we have a difficult time calibrating. So we don't know, is Anna's 5 the same as Bell's 5? Or is Anna's 5 the same as, say, Bell's 7? And in this particular context, in which what we are trying to measure is inequality, any assumption that we make about how Anna's utility compares to Bell's is going to be directly question begging, because what we're trying to get at is exactly how do they compare to one another. All right, so the envy test, don't get confused by the name. It has nothing to do with envy, the emotion. It's just a different way of asking about people's preferences. So you might know it depending upon what discipline you're in. You might have heard it called no envy or the envy test or envy freeness. These are all the same thing. And the idea here would just be that we would ask Anna, hey, do you prefer Bell's bundle? And then we would ask Bell, do you prefer Anna's bundle? So if neither prefers the other bundle, we would say that they're equal. If one and only one prefers the other bundle, we would say that they're unequal. And specifically, the way in which they're unequal is that the person whose bundle is preferred is going to be the one who's better off. And if there's mutual envy, there's sort of this question mark. So it's not quite clear what we want to say when there is mutual envy. I know of one person who says that when there's mutual envy, there's an inequality. What's weird about that is that the inequality has to go in both directions, right? So we would say Anna's worse off than Bell, and Bell is worse off than Anna, which is just a little bit weird, but it's possible. So I'm going to set aside the worry about mutual envy. But even if we set that aside, we have this different concern, namely that the envy test is just binary. So it's just going to say there is envy or there's not envy. And if we want to measure the extent of inequality, we need something more than just the binary result. So you might think that just a little minor tweak is going to change that. So here's the minor tweak. Instead of asking if there is envy, I'm going to ask about the extent of envy, right? So this is going to require that we're able to measure envy. I'm not convinced actually that there's any good way to do that. I talk about that elsewhere. But for now, let's assume that we have some way of measuring the extent of envy. And then what we're going to say is, look, the more envy there is, the greater the inequality. And the problem, even setting aside mutual envy and the problem of measuring envy, is that now we're going to get counterintuitive results. So here's an example. Let's say that Adam prefers oranges to apples and Eve prefers apples to oranges. And you have an apple and an orange, right? And you have to distribute them between them. So it looks really easy. You just give Adam the orange and Eve the apple. The problem, however, is that I'm going to introduce a constraint. So there's an external constraint on the assignment of bundles. So specifically, this constraint says the apple cannot go to Eve, and therefore the apple has to go to Adam. So the only question we have is how should we allocate the orange? And intuitively, it seems to me like we should give the orange to Eve, right? Because Adam already has the apple. And if we give the orange to Adam, then he's going to have both and Eve's going to have nothing. And that seems like that's a greater inequality. Nonetheless, if Adam's envy is sufficiently intense, it might be the case that we're going to minimize envy by giving both the apple and the orange to atom. So to me, that's just a counterintuitive result of using the envy minimizing test. All right, so in the very few minutes with which I've just discussed these three approaches, I have by no means established that we can't use any of these approaches, right? So all I want to say is that, look, they've got problems with them, problems that would need to be solved. So for today's talk, I'm just going to move on and see what else it is that we could do. So I'm going to move on now to talking about the desiderata that we would want our solution to solve. All right, so before I turn to the next slide, what I want you to do is think of this as an ink blot test. I'm going to do an ink blot test, and it's going to reveal a lot about how it is that you think about equality. So here we go. Here's the ink blot test. So looking at just the left-hand side of the slide, I want to know, is there an inequality? And looking at just the right-hand side of the slide, I want you to also answer, is there an inequality? So you'll have two answers. And I'll give you 2 seconds to answer that question. All right, so if I could see you all, which I can't, but if I could see you, I would ask for a show of hands. I would be really interested to know how many people think that there's an equality on the left-hand side and an inequality on the right-hand side. That is, in fact, my view, but it's very controversial. It might seem that it's not controversial. If you don't think it's controversial, you're like me. But in fact, this is a controversial judgment. So what I am going to say is that, look, if there's some other dimension in which Anna and Bell vary that we think should be taken into account, like, that there might be some respect in which Anna is needier than Bell, then I'm going to assume, sort of stipulate, that we would include that in the graph. So with that stipulation, which I realize is a big stipulation, I'm going to say that there's an equality on the left-hand side and an inequality on the right-hand side. And those are going to be my two desiderata. So the first desideratum just says, look, identical bundles are equal. And to see why that's controversial, let me just say here that both subjective utility and the egalitarian equivalent approach will sometimes violate that desideratum. So they will sometimes say, right, if Bell gets greater utility than Anna from the same bundle, subjective utility is going to say that they're not equal. All right, so here's the second desideratum. So the second desideratum says dominated bundles are unequal. So there's two definitions of a dominated bundle. So the first definition says that a bundle is dominated when it's better in no dimension and worse in some. So here an example would be that 2 apples and 2 oranges dominate 2 apples and 1 orange. So the second bundle is dominated because it's better in no dimension and worse in some. The second definition, and the definition I'm going to be using today, is a little bit more liberal. It says, look, a bundle is dominated whenever it's unanimously dispreferred in pairwise comparison. So the bundle 2 apples and no car is dominated by 1 apple and Aston Martin, even though there's one respect, namely the fact that it has 2 apples, in which the second bundle is better. All right, and just to see why this desideratum is also controversial, subjective utility, the envy minimizing approach, as well as the egalitarian equivalent approach are all going to violate it. So don't put too much emphasis on the desiderata. I'm just listing them here. I find them to be intuitive, but I'm going to wait until part 3, which I'm going to turn to right now, in order to show why I think that we ought to endorse these two desiderata. All right, so moving on now to talk about the solidarity solution. This is my own approach, and what makes it different, recall, is that I'm going to defer to everyone's preferences. All right, this is the most important slide in today's talk. This is a distinction that philosophers make that I think hasn't yet sort of trickled down into other disciplines so much. So they make a very hard and fast distinction between relational equality and distributive equality. So the relational egalitarians, and here I'm thinking of Elizabeth Anderson and Samuel Scheffler, they say, look, people should stand as equals. And exactly what that means is a little bit unclear. So one of the things I'm going to do today is try to flesh out what it means to stand as equals. Whereas in contrast, the distributive egalitarian says something should be distributed equally. Right, so the Amartya Sen's debate equality of what? So are we trying to equalize welfare or resources or capabilities or functioning? All of that is taking place on the right-hand side. So that all assumes that we're talking about distributive equality. So for a very long time, I placed myself on the right-hand side of the screen. I thought, yep, it's good for people to stand as equals. Got it. That's fine. That's great. But what I really care about is that something should be distributed equally. So I now think that was a mistake, that I wasn't taking relational equality seriously enough. And so I want to talk a little bit about why I think we need to start from this idea of relational equality. So one thing that some distributive egalitarians have done is they've said, yeah, it's true, we do care about relational goods. So we care about the fact that some people are humiliated, some people are treated with less respect than others, some people, are dominated, they're, in these positions of someone else has power over them. And so the distributive egalitarian says we care about all of those things. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take those things out of relational equality and we're going to include them in our equalisandum, so the thing that ought to be equalized. And the problem with that approach is that what the relational egalitarians were actually saying, and I think this comes out clearest in the works of Scheffler, is they were saying, look, relational equality is axiomatic. Distributive equality, on the other hand, has to be derived. So you can't just take these relational goods and include them in your equalisandum because that's missing the point. The point is that we have to start from something more foundational than distributive equality. So a relational egalitarian might say, yes, something has to be distributed equally. They might agree with that, but that's going to follow from starting from this position of relational equality. All right, so I got that distinction between relational equality and distributive equality, and I nonetheless thought, okay, but the gap between these two views is very, very small. Right? So the reason why, and I thought it was so small that we could ignore it. And the reason I thought it was that small was because I was thinking about one-dimensional equality. So assume that we're going to be distributing income and assume that everything else is held constant, right? So the only thing that we're distributing is income. There's no differences in desert, no differences in responsibility, no differences in jobs, etc. And nonetheless, let's suppose that that income is unequal. Some people have 20 times or 200 times more income than someone else. And I thought about that and I said, nope, we don't stand as equals, right? So I took this, good, it was distributed unequally, and I said, look, if it's distributed unequally, we have no explanation for it. We can't possibly stand as equals. And therefore, I thought that the gap between these two views was very small. But when I started thinking about multidimensional inequality, I started thinking that maybe the gap was more significant. So today I'm going to take really seriously relational equality, and what I want to do is look at what would it imply for the measuring multidimensional inequality. So I'm going to start with this left-hand side, relational equality. All right, so just to get at the intuition, think about two scenarios. So in the first scenario, you receive a bundle you rank last, even though someone else ranks it first. And in the second scenario, you receive a bundle that everyone ranks last. So it seems to me that there is an important normative difference between these two scenarios. And if there is a difference, it can't be anything about you, right? It can't be about your preferences. It can't be about how well you fare with that bundle because we can hold all of that constant. So it seems to me like there is a difference, and that difference is that there's an inequality in standing, that it says something when you're relegated to a bundle that everyone ranks last. And that's going to be the intuition that I'm going to be trying to work with to make it rigorous and to figure out what the implications of it would be. All right, so here's the solidarity solution. Step one, equality requires that people stand as equals. That's just saying, hey, I'm a relational egalitarian. And then step two, this is where I'm fleshing it out, says, Oh, and by the way, we don't stand as equals when the bundles are incompatible with cooperation. So the idea here is that we can't see ourselves as engaged in a cooperative venture with free and equal individuals. That's roughly the Rawlsian, idea that we should be engaged in a cooperative venture with free and equal individuals. And the idea is we can't do that when, for example, someone is avoidably relegated to a bundle that, say, everyone ranks last, or a bundle that no one would choose. Right. So what I want to get at is, what does it mean for these bundles to be compatible or incompatible with cooperation? And to do that, I'm going to suggest 4 rules. All right, so I'm looking at table 1 here, and X, Y, and Z here are bundles. So think of X as, say, a dental hygienist with a high COVID risk who makes $80,000. Y might be a kindergarten teacher with medium COVID risk and $45,000. And Z is a landscaper with low COVID risk and $25,000. So don't get upset. I might have these risks wrong. Maybe teachers face a higher risk. I'm just using this purely as an example. And what's going on is, in the table, is I'm just asking Annabelle and Claire to rank them. So there's no assignment going on. It's going to be the case that one of them is going to have to get bundle X, one will get bundle Y, and one will get bundle Z. But right now, I just want to know, how do they rank them? And in that particular table, table 1, they all rank Z last. And what we would know from that is that there would be no way for them to cooperatively distribute these bundles, right? Because no one's going to want Z because they all rank it last. So the first rule is that no bundle can be unanimously ranked last in order to stand as equals. All right, so in the second table, what's happened is that we've improved bundle Z a little bit, maybe by taking from Y. And Anna has now switched her preferences. So Z is no longer ranked last. Nonetheless, Z is dominated. So Anna, Belle, and Claire all strictly prefer X to Z. And so once again, no one's going to be willing to choose Z because it's dominated by X. So this gives us our second rule, which is that no bundle can be dominated in pairwise comparison. And note that the second requirement implies the first. So I could have skipped the first requirement. I'm just going through it in order to illustrate how we might become increasingly stringent. So the third requirement, now, if you look at Claire, she switched her ordering such that Z is no longer dominated, right? So Claire now prefers Z to X. Nonetheless, no one ranks Z first, right? So no one would choose it from among all bundles. So once again, we don't have cooperation compatible bundles. And that gives us our third rule: each bundle must be such that someone would choose it. Right, so in the fourth table, Claire now is indifferent between Y and Z, right? So perhaps we took from X and gave a little bit more to Z, such that Claire was just indifferent between them. And we still have a problem. So it's now the case that each bundle is such that someone would choose it. So we satisfied the third rule as well as the second and the first. Nonetheless, Anna and Belle are both going to fight for X. So we don't have 2 people who are willing to choose from among the set Y and Z. So this gives us our fourth rule, which says at least N people must be willing to choose a bundle from every set of N bundles. Right, sorry, at least N people. So here, in this case, we would need 2 people who are willing to choose Y and Z. All right, so when we do satisfy all 4 of those requirements, the bundles will be cooperation compatible. So in both tables 5 and in both table 5 and 6, we could assign these bundles in a way that would be envy-free. So if Anna got Z, Belle got X, and Claire got Y, they would be envy-free. So there is a cooperation-compatible distribution. So what I'm going to say is that here there exists an envy-free mapping of bundles to individuals, and I'm distinguishing that from an envy-free assignment. So if, for example, we discovered that there's absolutely no way that Anna can get Z, maybe she doesn't have the physical ability to be a landscaper, nonetheless, the bundles are still cooperation compatible. We still have this envy-free mapping, even though we no longer have an envy-free assignment. All right, So now going back to Professor Arneson's question, so remember he was looking at Smith and Jones, and one of them had the Jaguar and no beach access and the high school diploma, and the other person had a clunky car and let's see, a PhD from Yale and beach access. And the question was that he asked was who has a greater resource share? And unfortunately, I don't have an answer to that question. I can, however, ask and answer a different question, which is do they stand as equals? So if each prefers her own bundle in this case, or if each prefers the other person's bundle, then they're cooperation compatible, and that satisfies a necessary condition for equal standing. On the other hand, however, if they both strictly prefer the same bundle, then the bundles are not cooperation compatible and they do not stand as equals. And inequality in the cases that are of interest to me, so in which there's income, the inequality is going to be measured by the income transfer that's necessary in order to achieve cooperation compatible bundles. All right, so now we can look back at the two desiderata. Remember I said identical bundles are equal and dominated bundles are unequal. And that to me follows from taking relational egalitarianism as our starting point, right? So we're concerned about not just how do you, whether or not you prefer your bundle, but how do other people rank your bundle? And so in that case, what it turns out to look like is that we're going to get these two desiderata that I suggested in part 2. All right, so if I was giving a philosophy talk, this is where it would end, but I'm not giving a philosophy talk today. I want to actually do a little bit more and look at whether or not we could actually use the solidarity solution to measure multidimensional inequality. Like, is it useful or is it just pie in the sky? So this is very speculative. I'm just now starting to look into some of these next steps. So can we measure inequality? Well, in my book, I use a thought experiment, a hypothetical auction. And yes, using this thought experiment, we can measure inequality. The problem, of course, is that it's just a thought experiment. So can we actually do this, in reality? And that answer is going to be really complicated by the fact that there's going to be a possibility of multiple equilibria. So there could be multiple sets of cooperation compatible bundles, and that's going to make it very complicated and messy. Nonetheless, and I want to separate large scale and small scale. So starting first with thinking about this in small scale scenarios, I think absolutely we can use a solidarity solution to measure inequality. And I'm going to give this lovely web page, www.splitit.org. So I don't know if you've had a chance to look at this. I think it's a great web page. The phrase provably fair solutions are fighting words, but setting aside those fighting words, what it's going to do is give an envy-free solution. And it's just a fantastic web page. So if, for example, you and two of your friends are renting a house for, say, $1,000, and the problem is that the bedrooms differ, right? So the master bedroom is so much nicer than the second floor bedroom, and the third bedroom is even worse in the basement. You're trying to figure out, well, how much rent should each person pay? You can actually go onto this webpage and it will tell you the answer is fantastic. So just to give a little overview of how it would work, here you have, this is just a demo. So I have Alice, Bob, and Claire are trying to decide who's going to pay what for the rooms in the apartment. So what it asks you to do is it takes $1,000, that's the total rent, and then each person goes on separately and says, look, I'd be willing to pay $500 for the master bedroom. I'd be indifferent between that and paying $175 for the basement, and then I'd be indifferent between that and paying $325 for the second floor apartment, for a second floor bedroom. And it's going to look at each person's answer and it's going to spit out the envy-free solution. So it also does a little bit more. So it's not just telling you the envy-free solution, but it's picking among the various envy-free solutions. But for now, I'm going to set that latter part aside. So we could do something almost exactly the same, right? So we could say, hey, let's distribute $150,000 over job income bundles. So this is Anna, and let's say that her levels are, she would consider being a landscaper for $30,000 to be similar to being a teacher for $50,000 to being a dental hygienist for $70,000. All right, so this is a Messier version, but what I've done is I've just added Bell and Claire onto the scenario. So they all give different answers and they rate them differently. And then from that information, we could figure out an envy-free assignment. So for example, if we had Bell be the landscaper for $30,000 and Claire be the teacher for $40,000 and Anna be the dental hygienist for $75,000, that would be an envy-free assignment. And whenever you have an envy-free assignment, remember you're going to have cooperation compatible bundles. So I'm not concerned with how they're assigned. I'm just concerned with whether or not they're cooperation compatible. But so what we've done is we've defined a set of cooperation compatible bundles. Now, as it turns out, if you look at that information, there's going to be multiple sets of cooperation compatible bundles, right? Because Bell would be willing to do the landscaper for less than $30,000, it turns out. But this would be one set, and then we could define inequality by how much transfer of income would be necessary in order to make it the case that we get at least one of those cooperation compatible bundles. So if, for example, the dental hygienist was being paid $90,000, there would be envy, right? So we would have to transfer money in that particular case. All right, so all of that was on a small scale. My interest, though, is whether or not we could use this on a larger scale. So one approach that we might start thinking about would be going through those 4 requirements that I discussed in part 3 and thinking about how we could use a survey to measure them. So first, is any bundle unanimously ranked last? Is any bundle dominated? Is any bundle such that no one would choose it? And are there fewer than n people willing to choose a bundle from a set of n bundles? So I'm going to skip one. I think in many cases, if there is a bundle that's unanimously ranked last, it might be obvious that it might not be the case, but I'm going to skip it. In order to get at that information as to whether or not any bundle is unanimously ranked last, people would have to tell you their last ranked bundle. The second one is any bundle dominated is very informationally demanding, right? So people would have to give a full ranking of bundles in order for us to figure out whether any bundle is dominated. But fortunately, we can skip 1 and 2. We can jump to 3, and 3 is much less informationally demanding. So 3 only requires information about one's first choice. So here's a set of bundles. Which one would you choose first, or are you indifferent between, say, 3 of them, and you would just put an X next to them. And then the 4th step does not require any additional information, but it could be technically demanding depending upon the number of sets that would have to be checked. And that's just going to be an empirically contingent question as to how big the set of bundles are, but also whether or not we can eliminate some of the sets right off, or whether or not we have to go through each possible set. All right, so that would tell us a little bit about whether or not there is inequality. But to measure the extent of inequality, we would also need to identify the minimum transfer necessary for cooperation compatible bundles. And unfortunately, that's going to be a lot more difficult. So I'm just now starting to think about this. But the idea is that in addition to or instead of the survey, we might ask respondents to evaluate a subset of bundles using the sliding scale approach. So for example, split $150,000 between 3 jobs. And that would give us some way of approximating, right? It's not going to give us perfect information, but maybe we don't need perfect information. Maybe an approximation is good enough. So the jury is still out. Sorry for the lawyer reference. I didn't even realize I had one. But I'm optimistic that there's going to be creative ways to approximate this information. So I think we still don't know how well that's going to work. All right, so there's different reasons to measure inequality than poverty. That's sort of the first takeaway that I want. So, and I think we need to think about why are we measuring inequality versus why are we measuring poverty to figure out how we should measure inequality. So I think we need to take seriously relational equality. So start from this idea of whether or not we stand as equals. And then I add on this additional requirement, which says, look, in order to have equal standing, we have to have cooperation compatible bundles. So I'm optimistic that we can use the solidarity solution, but even if we can't, it nonetheless is going to provide the ideal. All right, so sorry about that. Where I want to just end up, I want to reiterate what I said at the beginning, which is that I think having more collaborations of the sort that this conference is promoting would be fantastic. So I hope that we can continue these conversations long after the conference is over. Thank you very much.
Now over to our first discussant, Luis Felipe Lopez Calva.
Thanks so much, James, and thank you for the excellent presentation. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation, which is extremely relevant and takes me away from the beginning. I thought it was really taking me away from the real world, but actually when you see the issues being discussed, you see the relevance of this for many of the questions we are trying to answer at this point. So I want to give comments that are, to be honest, a reaction to the reading of the paper on the COVID related application and to the presentation. So I hope they are not too disconnected and hopefully not so obvious or orthogonal to your thinking process. But the first general point I want to make is to go in more specific points is that this issue with the relational versus distributive equality, I think, in my view, if you look at the capabilities approach in a way, it addresses this point in the sense that, and it relates also to some of your analysis in the solidarity solution and so on. The fact that you can, if the space in which you measure this is the set of all the possible functionings people can choose from, and that defines your effective freedom. And eventually, if everybody has the same, set of functionings available, that it's an element of the what being distributed equally. So in that sense, that's the distributive equality. But at the same time, you are able to choose, and you stand as equal in the capacity to choose among those different combinations or bundles. So in a way, it makes, in my view, a point about the consistency between distributive and relational. And so in that sense, it really matters the space in which you define. I mean, what the definition of what is being distributed equally. So the equality of what question for me is fundamental. And that leads to a more specific point. You motivate your conversation on referring to the equalizing differentials discussion in labor markets. Basically, the idea that in equilibrium, different salaries should be consistent with the characteristics of the job you have. So in that sense, you can earn a lot more money, but actually you are equally well off because you chose to be in a job that could potentially have more exposure to certain risks and so on. And that leads to this idea, which is very relevant to say, can we measure inequality when we have bundles rather than unidimensional elements? And I think if one goes back to the multidimensional poverty discussion, one of their arguments, even though there are others, to say why it is important to have multidimensional poverty measurement, and I would say it would apply also to the inequality, is because there are dimensions for which markets don't work. So basically, you cannot convert income into that specific dimension because the market either doesn't exist or it's very imperfect. And that takes me to the very specific point you make, and sorry that I go directly into this very specific discussion on the bundle that compares income and risk. Because then the fact that, and I want to go back to this in a minute, the fact that there is a market for risk, I think it has a lot it has, I think, a high importance in understanding how you can measure these bundles. For example, if you think that higher income allows you to cope better with risk, I have a proposal of measuring middle class that has been used now in the bank and so on, based on vulnerability, on economic security. And one of the ways I motivate this is that people not only need to achieve a minimum bundle of goods, but also a minimum bundle of insurance. So in a way, once you are economically secure, so that your augmented income line allows you to be also protected against risks. And that augmented line defines whether you are economically secure or not. And that puts you either in the middle class or makes you vulnerable or actually poor. So that you discuss in your paper, for example, the idea that at the higher the income, the lower benefit you derive from a marginal increase in income, which is of course what there is concavity. But you should also consider, if you have the bundle income risk, the fact that if you have higher income, you might be able to cope better with that risk, and that influences your choice of that bundle. For another issue related to this, for example, you can think of, if you think in terms of indirect utility function, we know, this is an old result from the 70s, and Robert Masson and others wrote about that. If you have you face credit constraints, your indirect utility function has a kink when you hit the credit constraint. So in a way, even if you are risk neutral, you behave, that induces some concavity. So you behave as risk averse, even if you are risk neutral inherently, because you face this credit constraint. So the fact that there are these other market-related aspects that may influence your capacity, to assess these bundles, for me, is very important, because at the end we're talking about decentralized solutions. No. So I think this is important. Finally, one point before I move to my final point. So sorry, not finally, but before the final point is a behavioral element. You do mention subjective elements, but I think there is a lot of literature on the loss aversion. So the fact that it's not the same to reduce your income than to increase it. So loss aversion may play a role in your capacity to assess these bundles. And the other is what Dan Ariely calls the arbitrary consistency. If you start from no information whatsoever, the first bundle you get becomes your arbitrary reference, and then everything you compare to that. No, and in a way, I was thinking about that when you talk about the egalitarian equivalent approach. That the reference bundle really matters, and that reference bundle could be affected by these behavioral elements, and people can have access to very different sets of information. I close with one point, and again, I hope these elements are not so orthogonal to your thinking. The final point is related to COVID, because all this discussion that for me is extremely important conceptually, I find it more difficult when we apply it to COVID. There is this book in 2006, even before the financial crisis, about the great risk shift. The fact that certain economic policies, certainly to a large extent in the US, but in other countries as well, implied a transfer of risk from society to households individually, right? So risk is related to health insurance, even to mortgage markets, and certain laws that basically were transferring more risk to individuals and households, and instead of sharing that risk collectively. And that, in a way, ends up with the crisis 2009-8, where many people lose their wealth because of this risk. And then, of course, I could say the mother of all the crises, or mother of all the risks, which is the COVID risk. So my only concern about applying this to COVID-19 risk is that COVID-19 is an absorbing state for many demographic profiles. So basically, it's not just one kind of risk. It could be actually that then your capacity to generate income goes to zero, you die, basically. So in that sense, being an absorbing state, the way you assess that specific state in your risk profile could be a bit different. And then you have seen in the data how people who are staying at home because they can work from home. So basically means when capital can substitute the physical, the manual type of work, is concentrated in higher levels of income. And relatively lower levels of income are also exposed to more risk because the only way they can generate income is by being in the work site, right? So in that sense, for me, it's relatively obvious that COVID is distribution of risk due to COVID is pretty much regressive. So in that sense, the discussion about this type of specific type of risk in the multidimensional inequality discussion is sort of a second order, because for me, the data shows already that the risk distribution is reinforcing income inequality patterns. Again, it was really a great opportunity to read and think about these issues, and I hope the comments are somehow useful. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Luis Felipe. And now let's move on to Jeff Brand from our own Department of Philosophy, Trachtenberg School here at GW.
Thank you so much to the Institute and Professor Foster for inviting me to participate today. Professor Olson has a fascinating project here, terrific presentation. It really makes a significant contribution, I think, to the study of inequality measurement in the real world. It's a really substantive, instructive paper and presentation. I look forward to reading her book when Oxford publishes it later this year. So many of my reactions are just going to be invitations for her to elaborate. I'm sure she has a lot more to say on all these topics. Now, first, in the interest of full disclosure, I self-identify as a left-wing consequentialist. And in my more reckless moods, I even flirt with left-wing utilitarianism. So I'm certainly outraged, as many are, over the vast inequality of income and wealth in the US and globally. But for me, this is kind of just a shorthand way of saying millions of people have a really unacceptably low quality of life, and the rest of us could do a lot more about it, and we must do a lot more about it than we do. But turning now to Kristi's discussion of inequality measurement in multi-resource allocations. I think she identifies real weaknesses in the existing approaches, including those based on subjective utility and personal envy. What I want to focus really is on her desiderata, her claim that existing approaches conflict with what she calls our widely shared and deeply held judgments, specifically the judgments that dominated bundles are unequal and identical bundles are equal. Now, I would note that in this context, we have to understand unequal and equal in normative terms. So unequal means unequal in a respect that is pro tanto unjust. So we're really talking about what you might call equity and inequity. This kind of refers back to Olson's ink blot test. And I think the ink blot test does what she wants it to do. There are indeed lots of pairs of dominated bundles that we would intuitively regard as unequal. And there's lots of pairs of identical bundles that we would intuitively regard as equal. So suppose Jack and Jill are doing the same job for their employer under employment contracts with identical terms, same compensation, same benefits, hours, duties, working conditions, etc. I think Olson's absolutely right that we would intuitively regard these bundles as unequal, even if Jill subjectively enjoys the job more than Jack does. We don't think, for example, that the employer has a moral duty to compensate Jack more than Jill in order to offset Jack's low level of enjoyment. We don't think the law should require employers to do those offsets. Rather, we judge their bundles as equal because the formal terms of their contracts are identical. What I want to suggest is that if we define bundles exclusively on the basis of contractual terms, though, the judgment that identical bundles are equal is not actually a categorical across the board verdict. It's just a rebuttable presumption. So to use a cliched example, suppose Jack has a physical disability and he needs a moderately expensive assisting device of some kind to perform his job duties. If we still equate identical bundles with identical contractual terms, then many people are going to recognize that an identical bundle for Jack would actually be unequal. That's why we have disability accommodation statutes like the ADA. The presumption that identical bundles are equal bundles is actually rebutted here. In some cases, we think identical bundles are equal. In other cases, we think otherwise. And because we're philosophers, we can get more fanciful here. Imagine a world, an alternate reality in which there are well-established, publicly accountable procedures whereby employers determine on an individual basis how much each employee enjoys his or her work. Right? The employers use extensive psychological testing. They have sophisticated techniques for detecting employees who try to beat the system and underrepresent their enjoyment levels. And on the basis of these tests, employers provide job dissatisfaction bonuses to people who have lower levels of enjoyment. Right? Now, if we imagine all of that, very different world from ours, we imagine that the testing process reveals that Jill enjoys her job more than Jack does. And now the employer pays Jack more than Jill. My sense is that if this process were just normal, if it were reliable and commonplace and accepted, it wouldn't seem objectionable to people who are accustomed to it. Maybe not even to Jill, because after all, she might be getting a bonus relative to someone who enjoys the job even less than she does. So the presumption that identical bundles are equal is rebutted in this alternate reality. So why do we consider some goods but not others relevant to equality? In some cases, I think it's not actually because of the nature of the goods themselves. It's just because of certain empirical contingencies. And this actually puts me in mind of Dr. Lopez Calva's point about market failure, right? In some cases, it's just too burdensome to determine who has how much of which good. Transaction costs are just too high. Perverse incentives are created. That's why we don't, in our world, expect or want employers to give job dissatisfaction bonuses on the basis of psych evaluations. But if we could reduce transaction costs and solve those practical problems, it might actually be feasible. And if we lived in a society where it all worked, we might even come to regard it as intuitively unfair for an employer not to give a job dissatisfaction bonus. So to recap, I agree with Kristi to this extent. Our considered judgments affirm that identical bundles are presumptively unequal, same mutatis mutandis for dominated bundles being unequal, presumptively. But I think if you take a wider range of our considered judgments into account, they'll confirm that these presumptions are always rebuttable and that they are in fact rebutted under certain circumstances. And we can make a complementary point referring back to COVID. And an example that Kristi gives in the paper of an essential worker whom she quotes, this is a real person, who very understandably complains that it's unfair that she, the essential worker, makes less money and bears greater risk than does a non-essential worker who was laid off and sits at home safely during COVID collecting unemployment benefits. Now, I want to emphasize this is absolutely unfair. But Kristi treats this worker's outrage in the paper as evidence of a universal generalization about dominated bundles being unequal. And I think actually it doesn't quite do that. I think workers' anger about dominated bundles is highly selective and inconsistent. Maybe it shouldn't be, but it is. So I ask you to consider a healthy 30-year-old beneficiary of a trust fund who's never had to work a day in his life and who also gets to stay home safe during COVID. I think the essential worker should also be angry about him. Or consider the fact, going farther afield here, that people with conventionally attractive faces are paid more than those with less attractive faces. Why is the essential worker angrier about the non-essential worker collecting unemployment than she is about the trust fund baby or the prettier employees who make more money than she does? I don't pretend to understand why people notice some injustices at some times and ignore others that are at least as severe. I think this relates to Dr. Lopez Calva's point about what he called, I think, arbitrary consistency. I would speculate that the essential worker is focused on her socioeconomic peers. She has a kind of reference class. Suddenly it's very salient to her that the non-essential worker at home has a better bundle than she does. And the nature of the COVID response creates tremendous salience and gives us the sense that powerful people are doing this, setting this up in this unfair way. It may not be as obvious that powerful people also write the laws that allow trust fund babies to stay safe and comfortable and never work a day in their lives. But actually, powerful people are in charge of that too. So my point's really this. The fact that people get angry about particular dominated bundles at particular times isn't good evidence that such bundles are actually more unequal than other dominated bundles. And it's not evidence that people believe categorically that dominated bundles are unequal. COVID has made particularly salient a handful of the many, many injustices that have been there all along. Ironically, this is actually one of the few positive side effects of COVID, is that it's drawing people's attention to pre-existing injustices. So to sum up this part, I'd like to see how Olson accounts for a wider range of our considered judgments, encompassing not just those reflecting the presumption that identical bundles are equal, but also those concerning cases in which the presumption is rebutted. So now, moving quickly, I want to turn to Olson's solidarity solution, which I understand is saying for any set of n bundles and n individuals, the bundles are equal if and only if it's possible to map individuals onto bundles in a one-to-one correspondence such that everyone could get a bundle that's in her top tier that she weakly prefers. So I want to say again, this approach is a big advance over the ones that Olson considers. I can't say enough good things about it. It's elegant, it's internally consistent, it's coherent, it's compatible with some of our moral intuitions, and most significantly, I think it enhances the precision of relational egalitarianism as an abstract ideal. These are big theoretical virtues. So Olson says a set of bundles is cooperation compatible if her theory classifies them as equal. And cooperation compatibility is a tremendously interesting property for a multi-dimensional resource allocation to have. As a philosopher, I have to ask, does it have independent moral significance, and if so, why? And Olson's told us why. She's a relational egalitarian, and cooperation compatibility, she thinks, is necessary to standing as equals. Now, standing as equals is an inspiring phrase, but it requires a lot of interpretation. Maybe Kristi intends it as a term of art with a specific denotation. Otherwise, it's just a concept of which many conceptions are possible, and she offers just one. You might interpret standing as equals as a psychological concept, such that two individuals stand as equals if and only if they have certain mental states with respect to one another, like each subjectively feels respected by the other or feels equal to the other or something like that. I'm sure that's not what Olson has in mind. Her conception of equal standing is normative, not psychological. So feelings of mutual respect, subjective feelings, are neither necessary nor sufficient for us to stand as equals. And I think there's a key sentence of the paper, which also corresponds to a slide. It might be unfortunate when someone is relegated to a bundle she wouldn't choose. But Olson says, quote, it's objectionable in an entirely different respect when someone's relegated to a bundle that no one would choose. And the difference is that in the latter scenario, the individual is not treated as an equal member of her community, unquote. So I take it there's some kind of special indignity associated with receiving a bundle that no one would put in her top tier. And I'd like to know more about what exactly that special indignity is supposed to be. Because as I'm sure Olson recognizes, you can imagine an individual who gets stuck with a dominated bundle, but is just fine with it. And Olson would say that doesn't matter. He still doesn't stand as an equal in his community. And conversely, someone who gets stuck with a bundle that's terrible for him, a bundle he hates, why is it relevant to the measure of inequality that his neighbor would happen to be thrilled with that bundle? Right? If the bundles are, Olson says it doesn't matter, right? As long as the bundles are cooperation compatible, you got nothing to complain about. So this kind of reminds me of telling someone who's made worse off by a Pareto inferior transformation that he should be grateful it passes the Kaldor-Hicks test. So little joke for the economists in the room. Now, I'm sure, okay, thank you, James. So Olson, there's got to be a lot more going on here. There's obviously a conception of contractualism standing behind this. I'd like to know, is it Scanlonian contractualism, Rawlsian contractualism? What work is the contractualism doing? That seems like something that Olson would want to address, and probably does in her book, to be honest. So, all right, in light of time, I will just jump to my sort of closing idea. As a left-wing consequentialist, I want to know, if we achieve the left-wing consequentialists' poverty reduction, suffering reduction, deprivation reduction, capability enhancing goals, should we still care about promoting cooperation compatibility beyond that point? I'm not so sure. I'll leave you with this thought. Amazon founder Jeff Bezos is 89 times wealthier than Donald Trump. Intuitively, that fact is not a worrisome inequity. It's even less worrisome than another fact, which is that Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is 7.2 times as good looking as I am. And thanks to WebEx, you can all verify that. Not particularly worrisome. Needless to say, nothing I've said here detracts at all from the tremendous value and innovation of Kristi's project. She's doing great work for philosophy and for society, and I sincerely thank her for all of that. Thanks for listening.
Great. So now it would be fair, I think, to let Kristi have a response, a short one at that, but a response. Please go ahead, Kristi.
So there's so much there, I hardly even know where to begin other than to thank the discussants profoundly, and wishing that they had given me these comments 5 years ago when I started thinking about this project. So this is really fantastic. Thank you both so much. So just a few thoughts. So with respect to Dr. Lopez Calva, your questions, I think I'm on board with most of what you said. So I think actually, when I've been thinking about the quality of what debate separately, so resources, welfare, capabilities, functioning, I actually think that the relational, distributive, egalitarian distinction is useful for thinking about what the quality of what answer should be, and that so there's this use, and I think that's what you are pointing to, that actually that's incorporating some of sort of looking at the relational quality. So I think I'm completely on board. I think one thing that I did, which you rightfully picked up on, but I didn't mean it to come out quite the way, is I don't think there's any sense in which it makes, I don't think it makes any sense to look at just, say, COVID and risk, right? Even if you're looking at COVID, risk, and jobs, that set doesn't make sense as a set to single out. There's so many other things that would need to be included in that bundle in order for it to make sense as a bundle that we care about. And one of those is, so there's, ex ante risk and there's ex post risk, and there's it depends. If you get COVID, it matters whether or not you actually have access to healthcare, right? So in the United States, that's a huge issue, especially as so many people are losing their insurance. The reason why I was pointing out COVID and income in the paper was I think I was responding. I got a little bit upset with some of the people who are talking about just the income inequality. And what I wanted to say was, no, we can't just look at the effect on income inequality. We also have to look at the fact that we have so many low-paid essential workers. Some essential workers are well-paid, but we have many low-paid essential workers that are also bearing the brunt of this risk. And that was really what I was trying to call attention to. But I absolutely agree with you in terms of the practicalities. So many more things need to be included. I love your comment about prospect theory and the reference bundle. I hadn't thought about that, but yep, I take that all on board. I think that's right, that there's going to be that effect there, the loss aversion. And I also take on board your idea that there's going to be interaction effects. So looking at just income and looking at just risk is quite different than looking at income and risk. So if you get COVID, do you have a place in your house where you can stay separate from your family? I mean, that's going to be a function of your income largely. So yes, those are all great. Thank you very much. So looking at Professor Brand's comments, when you started talking, I will say that I wrote down in my notes that you can't prove a universal claim with examples. So yes, you're right. I cannot prove a universal claim with examples. And I regret very much if I implied in the paper that I was trying to do that. So yes, absolutely. I think I was just trying to make these desiderata intuitive. I'm not sure. So I sort of backed off presenting it as I don't want too much weight to be given to the desiderata because I think that the desiderata actually follow from my commitment to relational equality as opposed to any work comes from starting with the desiderata, right? So I think, yeah, ignore the desiderata, just say, okay, we've got this distinction between relational and distributive equality. And if you start from relational equality, I do think the desiderata follow, but you know, that's a whole different issue. So I'm not sure how much weight I have to give them, but you're right. Certainly I would need to say more than I said in that very short paper that you had. I was a little bit puzzled about the trust fund person example because my guess is that if you asked this essential worker who had to have high COVID risk how she felt about the trust fund worker, that she would resent that person very, very much. That's just my guess. So I wasn't sure empirically about what you were saying, but that doesn't actually matter. I take your point. And then, so one specific thing I want to pick up on in your last points is that I don't want to say, as you say, so I think it would be implausible to say, hey, look, you got the bundle that Fred would choose, so you have nothing to complain about. I'm not sure that that's entirely true. So I want to just add a few things that I didn't get to talk about in the paper. So one thing is that equality might not be Pareto efficient. So I just take that to be true. Some people define equity, for example, if we're talking about equity instead of equality, they define it as it has to be Pareto efficient as well as equal. But I just want these to be two distinct things. So we might care about equality, we might care about Pareto efficiency, we might care about both of them. So the difference between cooperation compatible bundles and then actually having an envy-free assignment is going to be that holding those bundles constant, you know, the envy-free assignment is going to be a Pareto improvement over the cooperation compatible bundles that aren't distributed in an envy-free way. So yes, it seems like, you know, there is something lost when we have cooperation compatible bundles, but we haven't distributed them in an envy-free way. And the thing that we've lost is efficiency. I mean, that's something that you can complain about, absolutely. I just wanted to separate that as something that might be different from equal standing. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that so there might be this worry that Fred has some really weird idiosyncratic preference, right? So Fred here is just this arbitrary stand-in person who has a really low, you know, is willing to take on a lot of COVID risk for very little income, just idiosyncratically. And then the worry is that then we're stuck with that bundle because it becomes cooperation compatible. So I want to say, look, cooperation compatible bundles are necessary, but they're not sufficient for equal standing, right? So this is just a necessary condition. So just to give an example of why they're not sufficient, so there could be two different ways in which I would say, look, we've got an inequality in standing. So the first is if you have some sort of discriminatory assignment. So if, say, Adam is indifferent between X and Y, and Eve strictly prefers X, but the sexist assigner deliberately gives Eve Y and gives Adam X, deliberately, right? There would be an inequality in standing there because it was done deliberately, right? So that would be independent of whether or not the bundles are cooperation compatible. And the second way in which, and this gets into the fact that Split It chooses amongst the various envy-free distributions, right? So not all envy-free distributions are equal. So the example that I give elsewhere is that if we're distributing cake and ice cream, and the cake's already been distributed, so there's a slice of vanilla and a slice of chocolate, and Professor Brand prefers a slice of chocolate, and I prefer the slice of vanilla, and he prefers it so much that he's going to choose the slice of chocolate no matter how I allocate the ice cream, and I prefer the vanilla so much that I prefer it no matter how I allocate the ice cream. And knowing this, I give myself all of the ice cream and hand him the plate. with the chocolate slice and no ice cream, that is stipulatively an envy-free distribution, so those bundles will be cooperation compatible. Nonetheless, it seems like there's some sort of inequality in standing there. So I think that the mere fact that bundles are cooperation compatible is not going to be enough. All right, I'm going to leave it at that. Let me just add, so one final thought is, I think you're absolutely right. A lot more needs to be said about how you go from equal standing to cooperation compatible bundles. You know, are you going to throw in mutual justifiability is the way that I do it. I'm not sure that I've yet done it satisfactorily, but I think that's the idea, is that at least in this paper, I was just suggesting, look, here's one way of making equal standing rigorous, this idea of cooperation compatible bundles, and now you still have to connect those dots. So I would love any thoughts that you have on how to connect those dots, but I will turn it over back to Q&A.
Hello. Yes, indeed. Thank you, Kristi. So let's proceed directly. First of all, Joshua Green was asking about, well, demand for different jobs can be different, therefore different earnings. How does the fact that demand is out there shifting, you know, how much people get, how does that impact your approach? Secondly, Lucia Raffanelli had asked a two-part question and said, arguably, people's preferences and rankings over different bundles are partly determined by existing inequalities. For instance, someone who grew up poor may be more willing to trade doing physical labor for more money, but their poverty or its effects on their preferences may reflect past injustices. Couldn't using preferences partly determined by past injustice to define equal standing end up reproducing objectionable inequalities or injustices? And then let me go to the next question. Take that in. From Trevor Jackson, we have, I'm curious about crashing this approach into Martin Haglin's work. Distribution of cars and beach access is about stuff, but getting COVID-19 is about distribution of your finite lifetime. Labor inequalities could be both. Does the amount and control over free time work the same way as bundles of apples or oranges? And finally, Hernando Grueso asks, well, go back to your discussion about the relationship between these dimensions. Does it matter to think about the causal connection between dimensions within inequality in order to compare different bundles? For instance, education can affect future income, and I'll have to stop there and let you answer them. Proceed.
All right, fantastic. These are wonderful. Yes, so demand is actually something I'm setting aside. So in my thought experiment, I'm like, okay, set aside demand, hold constant the occupational positions that currently exist, and figure out what they would pay just reflecting sort of labor burdens. Now, of course, that's going to make economists go crazy, sorry, but because it's going to be very inefficient. So, and I agree, absolutely, we have to care about efficiency, but I want to just think about equality first, and then we can think about efficiency second. So I am sort of, getting rid of demand in the first consideration. Then let's see, the question about, yes, so unfortunately, our preferences do reflect all sorts of horrible things. So there's sort of two responses. One is to say that I'm okay with laundered preferences. So if we need to launder preference, by that I just mean, if your preferences were set in such horrible conditions, maybe we have to think about what would your preferences be like in more ideal conditions. So I'm willing to think about that. Another thing to add is that I'm seeing this as an iterative, like a dynamic process. So it's not just the case that we would come down with, okay, here's the cooperation compatible bundles from now in perpetuity, but rather as people's preferences change, which I hope they would when the preferences are formed in better conditions, then we could reiterate the process and figure out how that would change things. So for example, currently certain occupations have a lot of status that goes along with the fact that they get lots of income. But if you change that such that they no longer got lots of income, they might also drop in status, and that would affect the desirability of the particular job. All right. So, yeah, that's another interesting interaction effect, which is that education affects income. So certainly these would have to be, like, people would have to be able to take the interaction effects into account when they're choosing amongst bundles, right? So having the Yale PhD versus a high school diploma might have some additional meaning that would need to be considered. That's absolutely right. I don't know. So I'm still inclined to think, so there might be a problem in terms of how well people are informed about how education transforms into income. But if we sort of stipulate that the necessary information is given, I realize it's a huge stipulation, but if we're willing to stipulate that, I'm not sure whether or not it matters whether that's what we're distributing versus, say, apples and oranges, although I would love to hear more about that. And then let's see, the last question was, perhaps you could repeat the last question.
I will do so. He said, I'm curious about crashing this approach into Martin Hagelin's work. Distribution of cars and beach access is about stuff, but getting COVID-19 is about distribution of your finite lifetime. Labor inequalities could be about both. Does amount and control over free time work the same way as bundles of apples and oranges?
Yeah, I mean, I could imagine all sorts of ways in which they wouldn't work the same. I mean, just like off the top of my head, obviously we care a lot more about one's lifetime prospects with respect to control over free time, as opposed to a flippant response, today where I say apples and oranges are, pretty much the same, but I might tomorrow really regret, that sort of decision if I was talking about something that mattered a lot more. So I mean, I'm inclined to think we could still use the same approach, but I'm totally happy to be pushed on that answer. So if you have further thoughts.
Great. So I have a couple more questions. I know we don't have time. We may go over by a couple minutes. Those of you who have other things to do may depart. But let's start with Brevin Anderson. Let's see what it says here. How do we account for time effects like delaying gratification, time legs and reward, focusing on children versus self, trajectory within bundles, desirable with downward mobility, undesirable with upward mobility, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one question. He talks about, let's see, we have a discussion about at what point does the largeness or smallness of a group make inequality measures less relevant? So Neil Sharma asks, how does individual agency fit into relational and distributive equality? I may have to settle for landscaping if getting a PhD is not really in my choice set. And someone by the name of James Foster noted that your discussion seems to get us into Sen's discussion of process freedom and the whole issue of Sen's discussion of freedom, which I think has a very interesting argument he had with Arrow and with me in a series of papers. So I'm kind of curious about your relationship between what you're doing and what Sen has done in separating out his idea of freedom.
Wow, okay, yes. Time effects and delayed gratification. I mean, this is another interesting one where, and I think this goes back to Professor Raffanelli's point as to if you grow up in impoverished conditions, that's going to change, that's going to have an effect on what sort of preferences you have. So it could be that growing up in certain conditions makes delayed gratification less of an option for you. It's less available to you because you've grown up in such horrible conditions. Yes, so I could see that being an issue. I do want, so when I talk about labor burdens and taking on jobs, I do want to be all inclusive. So you have to take into account the fact that you might have to spend 7 years of your life training to be, say, a doctor, right? That would have to be factored into. It's 7 years that might be horrible in many respects would have to be factored in. And for some people, that's not going to be as salient an option as it is for others. I think nonetheless, we can come to some sort of cooperation compatible agreement. At least that's my hope. It is interesting also the idea of downward mobility, upward mobility, because sort of the research suggests that that there's a difference between knowing that your life is going to improve, right, and having the same overall life in terms of moments of time, but knowing that it's getting worse over time. So it would be quite hard to get someone to choose that getting worse over time. So that is an interesting time dimension that I haven't thought about. The largeness versus smallness of groups. I do think that's interesting in terms of as groups become larger and larger, I no longer know who else is in the group. I no longer have much interaction with them. Perhaps I have no interaction with them. So I have no idea what they think about my bundle. And as we become less and less clear about how other people feel about our bundles, I think it's actually easier to satisfy this equal standing. It's when you're in like this small society and you know that everybody thinks it ranks your bundle last or no one would choose your bundle that I think it becomes especially salient as an inequality in standing. That reminds me of something one of the commentators said, but I'm forgetting about it. With respect to the individual agency, so it might be the case that being a landscaper, say, or getting the PhD is not within a certain person's set of options. And so you might also care about having that agency to choose. So I agree, absolutely. We care about having to choose. Part of my book is stipulating, look, we have freedom of occupational choice within the set of occupations that are available to us given our talents. And society should do things to try to remediate the fact that some people have less access to certain occupational positions. Nonetheless, I don't include that in the bundles. So the bundles are strictly talking about, so it could be that you have only one option available to you that is very unfortunate, but you can nonetheless stand as an equal, would be what I would say about that. And yes, as to process freedom, that's definitely something that I want to talk to you about more, and I still don't know exactly what it is that I think about that.
Good answer. On that note, why don't we bring it to an end today? I want to thank Kristi, our discussants, Jeff and Luis Felipe Lopez Calva, and all of the participants for joining us today. See you next time, Facing Inequality.